Most people were taught that the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. They were taught that the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own ideology, or because it could not keep up with the American military machine. They picture nuclear missiles on parade, tense standoffs in divided cities, and politicians making grand speeches about freedom. On the surface, that is the familiar story. But if you step away from the battlefield and look into the archives, a very different chapter begins to unfold. Before an empire collapses on a map, it usually collapses in a bank ledger first. The true weapon that brought down the second most powerful nation on Earth was not fired from a submarine or dropped from a bomber. It was pumped from beneath the sand in the Middle East. And it was engineered by men who understood that a superpower does not die when it runs out of bullets. It dies when it runs out of credit. To understand how an empire goes bankrupt without firing a single shot, we have to rewind to the early 1980s. On a military map, the Soviet Union looked terrifying, an unstoppable behemoth stretching across 11 time zones. They had the largest standing army in the world, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, and a massive intelligence network. But behind the Iron Curtain, the reality of the Soviet economy was far more fragile. The Soviet agricultural system was failing, completely unable to feed its own population. Year after year, Moscow was forced to import millions of tons of wheat from the West, just to keep its citizens from starving. But the West did not accept Soviet rubles. To buy food, and to maintain their massive military machine, the Soviets needed hard currency. They needed United States dollars. And they only had one reliable way to get them: oil. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had become heavily dependent on exporting its vast reserves of Siberian crude. When global oil prices were high, the dollars flowed into the Soviet Central Bank. This steady stream of petrodollars allowed the Kremlin to mask their internal decay, fund communist movements globally, and keep the breadlines relatively short. It was a credit empire, built entirely on the unpredictable foundation of a single commodity. This was the missing financial chapter that the CIA noticed. While the Pentagon was busy counting Soviet missiles and tanks, intelligence analysts at Langley were counting Moscow's foreign exchange reserves. They realized that the Soviet Union was not just a military superpower. It was, in financial terms, a heavily armed gas station. And like any business that relies on a single source of revenue, it had a fatal vulnerability. If the price of oil were to suddenly drop, the Soviet Union would immediately lose its ability to generate dollars. They would not be able to pay their short-term debt. They would not be able to buy grain. They would face a sudden, catastrophic liquidity crisis. But manipulating the global oil market was not something the CIA could do alone. To bankrupt an empire, you don't need an army. You need a backroom deal, and you need the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In 1981, William Casey became the director of the CIA. Casey was a former Wall Street businessman, a man who understood the ruthless leverage of debt and capital. He looked at the Soviet balance sheet and saw an opportunity for a financial ambush. Casey, along with key figures in the Reagan administration, began a series of quiet, high-stakes diplomatic meetings with the Saudi royal family. The Saudis were the swing producers of the world, sitting on the largest and cheapest oil reserves on the planet. Washington did not ask Riyadh for troops or for public alliances against Moscow. Instead, they proposed a strategic bargain. If Saudi Arabia would open their oil taps and flood the global market, they would drive the price of crude into the ground. In exchange, the United States promised the Saudis advanced military hardware, AWACS surveillance planes, and guaranteed security for the kingdom. It was a geopolitical calculation, written in the language of oil and debt. For years, the Saudis hesitated, reluctant to crash their own revenues. But by 1985, frustrated by other OPEC nations overproducing, the Saudis finally made their move. In the autumn of 1985, a decision was made in Riyadh that would change the map of the world. Saudi Arabia drastically increased its oil production, opening the valves from 2 million barrels a day to nearly 10 million. The global oil market was instantly flooded. the price of a barrel of crude went into a violent freefall. In a matter of months, oil crashed from over $30 a barrel to barely $10. For the Western world, it meant cheap gas. But inside the halls of the Soviet Central Bank, it was a financial death sentence. With every dollar that the price of oil dropped, the Soviet Union lost roughly $1 billion in annual revenue. Overnight, their primary source of hard currency simply evaporated. The Soviet ledgers turned a bleeding red. Moscow suddenly found itself completely starved of the cash it needed to survive. They scrambled for emergency loans, begging Western banks for credit to buy imported food. But without high-priced oil to use as collateral, the bankers in London, Frankfurt, and New York quietly closed their doors. The Soviet Union, the terrifying empire that had challenged the United States for 40 years, was effectively bankrupt. They could no longer afford to sustain their military operations in Afghanistan. They could no longer afford to subsidize their satellite states in Eastern Europe. And most dangerously, they could no longer afford to feed their own people. When a government runs out of money, the politicians do not immediately feel the pain. The bill is always handed down to the streets. Across the Soviet Union, the loss of petrodollars translated into empty store shelves. Basic goods disappeared. Inflation spiraled out of control. Ordinary citizens found themselves standing for hours in the freezing snow, just hoping to buy a loaf of bread or a piece of soap. The people were paying the price for an empire's insolvency. The public anger that eventually tore down the Berlin Wall was not just born out of a desire for political freedom. It was fueled by a systemic, crippling economic collapse, engineered in a boardroom halfway across the world. The Soviet system had been rotting from the inside for decades, but it was the collapse of the oil market that finally cut off their life support. The greatest conflict of the 20th century did not end in a blaze of nuclear fire. It ended with a quiet, devastating margin call. History remembers the politicians who signed the treaties and the crowds who tore down the walls. But the ledger remembers the exact moment the money ran out. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a Cold War is not a missile silo. It is a plunging commodity chart and a secret agreement between two nations to turn off the cash flow of an empire.